My name is Eleanor Brooks, and the day the lawyer slid a dusty envelope across the polished oak table and said, "This is everything your husband left for you," my own children laughed out loud, not a nervous chuckle, not a polite cough. They laughed right there in the office, where my husband's name was still warm on everyone's lips. I sat perfectly still, hands folded while the room tilted, and the truth struck me harder than the dirt hitting his coffin. The funeral had been 3 days earlier, on a gray morning that smelled like wet leaves and cold stone. We buried Robert in the same town where we'd raised our children, where I'd volunteered at the library and baked casseroles for neighbors who needed comfort. The church was full business partners in dark suits, old friends with white hair and soft eyes, and our children standing tall, already measuring the world with a new kind of confidence. $30 million will do that to people even before the will is read. I'd been married to Robert for 42 years, long enough to know the rhythm of his breathing in sleep, the crease between his brows, when he worried the way he said my name when he needed grounding. I was there when he took his first loan, when he missed dinners, to close deals when the companies grew and the properties multiplied. I kept the house running, balanced the checkbooks before software did it for you, raised the kids, and learned to be quiet when quiet was required. I never asked to be seen. I asked to be steady. The lawyer began with the formalities: names, dates, trusts and holdings, companies, real estate, apartments, cars. The list went on, each item landing like a gavel strike. Our children, Daniel, Claire, and Matthew, sat straighter with every sentence. They exchanged glances that said, "This is ours now." When the lawyer finished detailing the empire, $30 million spread across businesses and properties, he paused, cleared his throat, and finally looked at me. "And for Mrs. Brooks," he said, "your husband left this." He slid the envelope toward me. It was old edges softened, as if it had been handled many times. Dust clung to the corner. I noticed that before anything else. Dust has a way of telling the truth, how long something has waited. There was a beat of silence. Then Daniel laughed. "That's it," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. Claire smiled the way she used to when she was embarrassed but didn't want to admit it. Matthew looked at the table. No one stopped the laughter. No one corrected it. I felt heat rise to my face, but I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't open the envelope. I nodded once, thanked the lawyer, and folded the envelope into my purse like it belonged there. Years of marriage teach you how to swallow moments whole. Afterward, the children talked logistics. They spoke over me, around me, downsizing, selling properties. "Mom will be fine," Daniel said already, tapping numbers into his phone. "She's simple, simple." As if a woman who'd held a family together through recessions and relocations was a footnote. That night, I went home to the house Robert and I had bought when the kids were small. The hallway light hummed. His coat still hung by the door. I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope in front of me, and didn't open it. Not yet. I needed to hear my own thoughts before anyone else's. The days that followed were worse. The children grew busy. Meetings, calls, plans. They suggested I move closer to Claire for convenience. Daniel asked if I'd thought about assisted living eventually. Matthew stopped by, once looked at the house like it was already gone, and said nothing. On the fourth night, after the house had gone quiet and the grief had settled, into something heavier. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no legal jargon, just Robert's handwriting. Steady, familiar, and a bank account number. Beneath it, one line. "This is for the woman who always loved me truly." That was it. No explanation, no amount, just trust. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. Part of me expected nothing. Another part feared everything. Was it a mistake? A sentimental gesture with no substance. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I slept little that night, the sentence repeating in my mind, like a vow renewed too late. The next morning, I drove to the bank, where we'd opened our first joint account decades ago. The teller was young, kind, and patient. She typed, she paused, she looked at the screen again. "Ma'am," she said softly, "would you like to step into an office?" I followed her down a quiet hallway. The manager joined us. Numbers were printed. Explanations were offered. I heard them as if through water. The balance was real, more than real. It was deliberate. Robert had planned this. I walked out into the sunlight with my purse on my shoulder and my back straight. The world hadn't changed. The people had. And for the first time since the laughter in that lawyer's office, I smiled not because I'd won, but because I finally understood. The days after the will reading taught me more about my children than the 40 years before it ever had. Grief didn't soften them, money sharpened them. Daniel called first, not to ask how I was sleeping or whether I'd eaten. He wanted paperwork, keys, documents, anything Dad might have left lying around. His voice was brisk, professional, already distant. When I told him I'd look, he reminded me that time mattered now. "Opportunities don't wait," he said. I almost laughed. Neither does character. Claire visited a week later. She walked through the house with the polite discomfort of a guest commenting on the wallpaper like it was temporary. She suggested I sell while the market was strong. "It's too big for you," she said gently, the way people do when they've already decided what's best for you. She hugged me before leaving a light touch and whispered that she worried about me being alone. I watched her taillights disappear and realized she worried more about being inconvenienced. Matthew was the hardest. He'd always been the quiet one, the child who watched before speaking. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where Robert used to drink his coffee. "They're just stressed," he said, not meeting my eyes. "It's a lot to manage." I nodded. I knew stress. I'd lived with it my whole life. What I saw now wasn't stress. It was relief. They began to make decisions without me. Meetings scheduled I wasn't invited to. Emails forwarded for your information. They talked about trusts and restructuring like I was a fragile heirloom present, but not participating. Daniel suggested I give him power of attorney just in case. Claire mentioned a retirement community she'd toured with a friend. Matthew stayed quiet, which felt worse than the rest. I said very little. Silence had always been my language. It confused them now, and that gave me space. At night, I sat with the envelope on my dresser, unopened again since the bank. I hadn't told anyone what I'd found, not a word. The money wasn't a weapon, not yet. It was a truth. And truths work best when revealed at the right time. I thought about my marriage in those quiet hours. About the years I'd signed papers without reading them because I trusted the man across the table. About the nights I'd stayed up balancing accounts while Robert slept about the arguments we didn't have because I chose peace. Loving truly, I realized, doesn't always look romantic. Sometimes it looks like restraint. The children's calls grew less frequent and more transactional. Daniel needed signatures. Claire wanted advice on staging a property. Matthew asked if I'd found Dad's old files. None of them asked if I'd opened the envelope. Perhaps they assumed it held nothing worth mentioning. One afternoon, I overheard Daniel on the phone when he stopped by unannounced. "She'll be fine," he said, pacing the living room. "Mom doesn't need much." I stood in the doorway and waited. He turned startled and smiled too quickly. We talked about the weather. He left soon after. That night I made a decision, not out of anger, out of clarity. I called an attorney, not the family one. A woman my age with a calm voice and a reputation for discretion. We met in her office the following week. I told her everything about the envelope, the account, the children, the house. She listened without interrupting. "You're not obligated to explain yourself," she said when I finished, "but you should protect yourself." Protect. The word felt foreign and necessary all at once. We reviewed documents. She explained structures I'd never questioned. Robert had been careful, very careful. The account was mine, fully, legally, untouchable. More than that, certain companies still required my approval for major changes. I hadn't known, I hadn't needed to. Robert had. Walking out of that office, I felt taller, not triumphant, grounded. The children sensed something shifting, even if they didn't know what. Their tone softened slightly. Daniel invited me to lunch. Claire asked my opinion about a property sale. Matthew stayed longer when he visited. I gave them what I always had, patience, warmth, and nothing more than I chose. I didn't confront them, not yet. I watched, I listened. I learned who they were becoming and who they thought I was. At night, I sat in the quiet house and thought about what reconciliation might look like. It wouldn't come from winning, it would come from honesty. From letting them see me, not as an obstacle or a dependent, but as a woman who had loved deeply and planned wisely. I kept the envelope, I kept my silence, and I waited. I didn't open the envelope again for several days after the bank. Not because I was afraid of what it contained, I already knew that, but because once a truth settles into your bones, you don't rush it. You let it teach you how to stand. The envelope stayed on my dresser beneath the small framed photo of Robert and me, taken the year we paid off the house. We looked tired in that picture, but content. Every morning I passed it on my way to the bathroom. Every night I saw it before turning off the light. It felt less like paper now and more like a conversation that had been waiting a long time. I thought back to the night Robert had given it to me, though at the time I hadn't known what it was. He'd slipped it into my hand without ceremony while we stood in the kitchen after dinner. "Hold on to this," he said, "just in case." I'd smiled and tucked it away without asking questions. I trusted him. That was our arrangement. The children hadn't known about that moment. They hadn't known about many moments like it. They'd grown up seeing their father as the architect and me as the support beam necessary but invisible. I wondered if Robert had seen this ending coming, if he'd anticipated the way grief and money could strip away politeness and leave something sharp behind. One evening, Daniel called to tell me the companies were being restructured. Just a heads up, he said, as if I were a tenant, not a widow. Things will move fast. I told him I understood. After hanging up, I sat at the table and unfolded the paper inside the envelope, reading Robert's handwriting again. The line hadn't changed, but I had. The next morning, I went back to the bank, not to check the balance again, but to ask questions, practical ones, about access, about timing, about protections. The banker explained options calmly, professionally. I nodded, took notes, and asked for nothing more. Knowledge is a quiet kind of power. When I returned home, Claire was waiting in the driveway. She said she was in the neighborhood. She stepped inside and looked around, lingering on the walls, the shelves, the furniture. "You should really think about what you want to keep," she said, "before things get complicated." I watched her carefully. "What do you think will get complicated?" I asked. She hesitated. "Well, estates always do." I smiled and poured tea. We sat across from each other like strangers. She talked, I listened. When she left, she hugged me longer than usual. Guilt has a way of reaching for reassurance. That night, I took the envelope from the dresser and placed it in my desk drawer beneath a stack of old letters Robert had written me over the years. I reread one from early in our marriage, when we'd been young and unsure. He'd written about trust then, about how love wasn't proven in grand gestures but in preparation. Preparation, the word stayed with me. I began to prepare quietly. I updated my own documents, reviewed beneficiaries, met with the attorney again to understand my position fully. Each step felt less like revenge and more like respect. For myself and for the man who'd trusted me with this final truth. The children continued their orbit, close enough to feel familiar, distant enough to forget my presence when it suited them. Daniel spoke of expansion. Claire spoke of lifestyle. Matthew spoke of nothing, which spoke volumes. One afternoon, I took a drive to the old office building Robert had bought when the companies first took off. I sat in the car and watched people go in and out, carrying coffee and files and confidence. I hadn't been there in years. I hadn't needed to be. But now I understood that my absence had been a choice, mine and Robert's. When I returned home, there was a voicemail from Daniel. He sounded frustrated, something about approvals taking longer than expected. I called my attorney instead and asked a single question. She answered it plainly. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself and ate slowly. I thought about the confrontation to come, about what I would say and what I would leave unsaid. I didn't want to shame my children. I wanted them to see, to understand that love doesn't disappear when it isn't loud. I took the envelope out one last time and held it in my hands. The paper was thin. The message was not. Robert hadn't left me money to punish our children. He'd left it to protect me, to make sure I wouldn't be diminished by anyone else's assumptions. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back where it belonged. Then I turned off the light and went to bed knowing that soon the silence would break, not with anger, but with truth. The balance did not change who I was. It clarified who everyone else thought I had been. I didn't tell the children what I'd discovered. Not after the bank manager slid the printed statement across the desk and quietly said, "You're very secure, Mrs. Brooks." Not after my attorney confirmed in language both gentle and precise that the account was mine alone, clean, protected, intentional. I said thank you, folded the paper, and put it away like a woman who had spent a lifetime learning when to hold and when to release. Instead of speaking, I watched. Daniel's confidence began to fray first. Expansion costs money, and money has opinions. He called me twice in 1 week, both times asking questions that circled the same frustration. Approvals weren't coming as fast as expected. Banks were cautious. Investors asked for assurances. Dad used to handle this stuff, he said, irritation slipping through. I told him I was sorry to hear that. I didn't offer advice. Claire's life looked perfect from the outside. New clothes, charity events, photos posted with captions about gratitude and family. In person, she was restless. She talked about stress, about expectations, about how people changed when money was involved. I nodded. I agreed. I didn't remind her who had changed first. Matthew watched it all with quiet concern. One evening he stayed after dinner and helped me wash dishes like he used to when he was young. "You okay, Mom?" he asked finally. I looked at his reflection in the window and said yes. It wasn't a lie. It was a boundary. Behind the scenes, I moved carefully. I didn't spend wildly or make announcements. I met with professionals, an accountant, a financial planner, another attorney, to review what the first had prepared. I asked questions I'd never asked before, not because I hadn't cared in the past, but because I'd trusted someone else to care for me. Trust is beautiful. It is also fragile. I learned that Robert had structured the businesses in layers, some visible, some quiet. He had always known that power draws attention and protection requires discretion. Certain decisions could not be made without my consent, not because I demanded it, but because he had written it that way years ago, long before illness or death, long before our children thought they understood the future. One afternoon, Daniel showed up unannounced again, this time with papers. "Just routine," he said, laying them out on the table. "We need signatures to move forward." I read every page slowly. When I reached the section that required my approval, I stopped. "I'll need time to review this," I said. He blinked. "It's standard." "I'm sure it is," I replied, folding my hands. "I'll get back to you." The silence that followed was thick. He gathered the papers, irritation tightening his jaw. "We're on a timeline, Mom." "So am I said evenly. That night, I sat with the envelope again, not to read the note, but to remember the intention behind it. Robert had not left me this account to prove a point. He had left it so I would never have to beg for space in my own life, so I could choose generosity without obligation, so I could stand quietly and still be seen. The children began to sense resistance, not confrontation, resistance. Claire asked if I was upset. Matthew asked if something was wrong. Daniel stopped asking and started assuming. I let them. I used my resources thoughtfully. I funded the library's renovation project that had stalled for years. I set up a scholarship at the community college Robert had attended briefly before life took over. I did these things quietly, without press releases or praise. The satisfaction came not from recognition, but from alignment, my actions matching my values. Whispers reached the children. Daniel mentioned hearing my name in a meeting. Claire asked how I knew certain people. Matthew listened more carefully than before. The truth has a way of moving through a family, even when no one speaks it aloud. Eventually, the requests came, not demands this time, but invitations. Daniel wanted to talk. Claire suggested a family dinner. Matthew asked if we could all sit down together just to check in. I agreed, not because I felt cornered, but because the moment had ripened. I prepared for that meeting the way I'd prepared for everything else with clarity. I wrote down what I wanted to say and what I would not say. I reminded myself that this wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition, about teaching without humiliating, about offering reconciliation without surrendering dignity. On the morning of the dinner, I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to honor myself. I placed the envelope in my purse, not as a threat, but as a reminder of love, of foresight, of the quiet power of being underestimated. The balance had changed nothing and everything at once, and by nightfall, the silence that had protected me would finally make room for the truth. I did not announce my strength, I practiced it. The days leading up to the family dinner were oddly calm, too calm. Daniel's messages softened. Claire sent a text asking if she could bring dessert, as if sugar might smooth what words could not. Matthew called to ask what time he should come. No one asked what the meeting was about. They already knew something had shifted. People always do. That afternoon, I walked through the house, slowly touching familiar things. The banister Robert had sanded himself the framed photos that captured more effort than glamour. I thought about how many times I had been told I was lucky. Lucky to have a successful husband. Lucky to have capable children. No one had ever said I was capable. That omission had taught me patience. Now it taught me clarity. The dinner began politely. Too politely. We talked about the weather, about traffic, about nothing at all. I watched my children the way a gardener watches plants. After a storm, checking for damage, noting what bent and what broke. Daniel was restless. Claire smiled too often. Matthew stayed close to me, quiet but attentive. Halfway through the meal, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, "we've been meaning to talk to you." I nodded. "I know." He glanced at his siblings, then back at me. "There are some decisions coming up, big ones, and we realized maybe we haven't included you as much as we should have." Claire jumped in. "We just want to make sure you're comfortable," she said quickly. "Secure." Secure. The word landed differently now. "I appreciate the concern," I said. "But before we talk about decisions, there's something I need to share." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for my purse. I didn't dramatize the moment. I simply met their eyes one by one. "When your father and I were married," I continued, "we made choices together. Some were loud, some were quiet. This is one of the quiet ones." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said gently, "that your father planned for this moment. For all of us." I told them about the envelope, about the account, about the note. I didn't share numbers. I didn't need to. The truth carries its own weight. The room went still. Claire's smile vanished. Daniel's face flushed, then paled. Matthew closed his eyes just for a second. "You knew," Daniel said finally. "You knew this whole time." "I knew when it mattered," I replied. "And you didn't say anything?" Claire asked, her voice tight. "I was watching," I said, "listening." Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. "So this is leverage?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's context." Silence stretched. The clock ticked. I let it. "I don't want your money," Claire said abruptly. "That's not what this is about." "I know," I said. "This is about how quickly I became invisible." Matthew spoke then softly. "Mom, I'm sorry." The words broke something open, not all at once, not cleanly, but enough. I explained the boundaries I'd already set, that certain decisions required my consent, that I intended to be informed, not overridden, that I would help where I chose, not where I was pressured. I told them I wasn't interested in punishment. I was interested in respect. Daniel's shoulders slumped. We thought you didn't want to be involved." "I wanted to be included," I said. "There's a difference." The conversation wasn't neat. Apologies came in pieces. Defenses surfaced, then softened. Claire admitted she'd been afraid of responsibility, afraid of failure. Daniel admitted he'd assumed control meant competence. Matthew admitted he'd stayed quiet to keep the peace. I listened to all of it. At the end of the night, I stood and cleared the table myself, the way I always had. Claire moved to help me. So did Matthew. Daniel hesitated, then joined us. The small gesture mattered more than any words spoken earlier. After they left, I sat alone in the quiet house and breathed deeply. I hadn't won. I hadn't lost. I had stood where I belonged. In the weeks that followed, the tone changed. Meetings included me. Questions were asked, not assumed. Daniel sought my opinion. Claire checked herself before speaking for me. Matthew stayed close, bridging gaps when they formed. I used my resources carefully. I helped stabilize a struggling branch of the business, but only after Daniel listened. I supported Claire's charitable interests, but insisted on transparency. I funded education, not indulgence. Each choice reinforced the same lesson: power used quietly lasts longer. I felt Robert's presence often then, not as grief, but as confirmation. He had trusted me with more than money. He had trusted me with timing. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to disappear. The confrontation didn't end that night. It began. In the days that followed the dinner, the air between us shifted lighter, in some ways heavier in others. Truth does that. It removes the weight of pretending, but replaces it with the work of repair. Daniel called more often, not with demands but with questions. Claire sent articles and asked what I thought. Matthew came by just to sit with me sometimes in silence. I accepted all of it without rushing forgiveness. Healing like trust needs room. The real test came when the cracks widened. A deal Daniel had been counting on stalled. Not because of market conditions, he blamed those, but because partners wanted assurances they no longer felt comfortable giving. "They're nervous," he said over coffee one morning, rubbing his temples. "They want stability." "Stability comes from consistency," I replied, "and from listening." He looked at me, then really looked as if recalibrating an image he'd carried too long. "Will you come to the meeting?" he asked, not because he had to, because he wanted me there. I went. I sat at the table and spoke when it mattered. I didn't grandstand or correct him publicly. I asked questions that reframed the conversation. The room responded. When it ended, one of the partners shook my hand and thanked me. Daniel noticed. He didn't smile, but he didn't bristle either. That was progress. Claire faced her own reckoning. A charity she'd backed came under scrutiny for poor oversight. She was defensive at first, embarrassed by the attention. "They're being unfair," she said. I asked her what she knew and what she assumed. We reviewed documents together, the way we used to do homework at the kitchen table. She learned. she apologized to me and to herself. Matthew's confrontation was quieter. One afternoon, he admitted he'd been afraid of choosing sides. I didn't want to lose anyone, he said. I told him that silence can feel like safety, but it often costs the most. He nodded. He began speaking up. Weeks turned into months. We met regularly, not as a board, but as a family. Agendas existed, but so did pauses. I set rules gently and kept them firmly. No decisions without discussion, no assumptions without verification. Respect first, always. Then came the moment I hadn't planned for. Daniel asked if I would consider transferring a portion of my account into a shared trust to simplify things, he said carefully. The old reflex stirred, accommodate, smooth give. I breathed through it and asked him why. He answered honestly. Because I'm still scared, he said, and because I don't want to repeat the mistakes we made at the beginning. I considered it, not the request, the intention. I'll think about it, I said, and I'll decide. That answer mattered. I met with my attorney again, laid out the request, and asked for options. We created a structure that preserved my independence while supporting the family's long-term health. Boundaries written clearly tend to hold better than promises spoken quickly. When I presented the plan, Daniel listened without interrupting. Claire asked thoughtful questions. Matthew smiled, small relieved. No one laughed, no one mocked. The room felt earned. That night after they left, I took the envelope from my desk drawer and held it once more. I didn't need it anymore, not as proof or shield. The lesson had landed. I wrote each of them a letter, not to explain myself, I'd done that, but to remind them of what we'd shared before money complicated our language. I thanked them for trying. I named what had hurt me and what had healed. I told them I loved them, and that love, like trust, is strengthened by honesty. Reconciliation didn't arrive like a parade. It arrived like a habit, formed slowly, practiced daily. We stumbled, we corrected, we kept going. Looking back, I understand now that Robert's final gift wasn't the money. It was the space to choose dignity over reaction, to teach without shaming, to be seen without demanding it. If you're listening to this and seeing yourself in my silence, know this preparation is not suspicion. It's love with foresight. Estate planning isn't about predicting betrayal, it's about preventing it from becoming destiny. And independence at any age is not a threat to family. It's a foundation for healthier connection. I didn't take revenge, I took my place. The house feels different now. Not quieter, just settled. The kind of calm that comes after a long storm, when the ground is still damp but the sky has decided to keep its promise. Time did what no argument ever could. It softened sharp edges and exposed what was real underneath. Daniel learned that leadership isn't proven by speed, but by steadiness. He still moves fast, but he listens now. When decisions stall, he calls me, not for permission, but for perspective. He doesn't always follow my advice. That's fine. He asks. That's new. Claire changed in subtler ways. She became more careful with words, more honest with herself. She stopped performing gratitude and started practicing it. One afternoon, she admitted she'd been afraid of becoming irrelevant. I told her relevance isn't claimed, it's earned through care. We laughed then, the kind of laugh that doesn't need witnesses. Matthew stayed as he always had, quiet, observant. but he began stepping forward when silence no longer served anyone. He became the bridge, not by force but by presence. I see his father in him more clearly now. As for me, I learned something I wish I'd known earlier. Independence is not abandonment. Standing in your own strength doesn't mean you love less. It means you love without fear. I never told them the exact balance in that account. Numbers have a way of distracting people from meaning. What mattered was that I could choose how to help, when to step back, what to protect. Choice restored my voice. We still have disagreements. Money didn't vanish, neither did memory. But when tensions rise, I notice something remarkable. No one laughs at me anymore. No one speaks over me. Respect once reclaimed tends to stay reclaimed. On quiet mornings, I sit by the window with my coffee and think about Robert, about how well he knew us all. He understood our children's ambition and my patience. He knew that the loudest inheritance wouldn't be the safest one for me. So he left me something quieter and trusted me to know when to use it. That trust changed everything. If you're listening and you've ever felt dismissed, underestimated, or quietly pushed aside, I want you to hear this clearly. Your silence does not mean you have nothing to say. It means you've been choosing when to speak. And when you do, your words can reshape an entire room. Prepare, ask questions, protect yourself not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. And don't confuse peace with passivity. Peace, real peace, is built on clarity. Families survive when honesty is allowed to arrive without punishment, when reconciliation isn't rushed but chosen, when love isn't used as leverage but offered as truth. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own life, your own family, your own moments of quiet strength, I invite you to reflect on it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity doesn't expire with age. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about resilience, wisdom, and justice done softly, consider subscribing and staying with us. Some lessons are loud, the most powerful ones are not.